Hello everyone! For our first solo review of 2025, I've decided to talk about a movie I wanted to discuss last year, and the year before that, 1956's X the Unknown. This British sci-fi horror movie from Hammer Film Productions is set in a Scottish village where soldiers in a Geiger counter training exercise encounter a mysterious source of intense radiation. I saw the beginning of this some years ago, and I always meant to go back and see the rest, and that inclination was intensified after I watched the Quatermass Experiment 1955 and Quatermass 2 1957 a couple years ago. These three titles are sometimes lumped together, not just because they're black and white Hammer sci-fi horror films, but because of their stylistic and thematic similarities. So when I reviewed those two movies in 2022, this kept coming up. A couple people asked me if I had seen it, and I could only say I've seen some of it, and I wanted to rectify that, and I also was inclined to give it a second chance, because the first time didn't go especially well. So I intended to review this. Here we are, a couple years later, finally getting to it. In fact, after the successful release of the Quatermass Experiment, a film I liked a lot, X the Unknown was initially conceived to be its sequel, but writer Nigel Kneale wasn't on board with that, so a new story with original characters was created instead, featuring the first of Jimmy Sangster's many screenplays for Hammer Films. Sangster writes an amusing chapter about this in his book, Do You Want It Good or Tuesday, detailing how he unexpectedly and abruptly went from being Hammer's production manager to their screenwriter. This is a very entertaining book. I'm not even the biggest fan of Hammer horror films, but there's a lot of information here, a lot of anecdotes, and he is a very funny writer. Sangster corroborates the stories that this production was a mess, contending with bad weather and bad tempers. Blacklisted American director Joseph Losey started working on the film, but was soon replaced by Leslie Norman. Whether Losey left of his own volition due to illness or a lack of interest in the project, or he was replaced because the star refused to work with an alleged communist sympathizer, is a matter of some debate. Regardless, he was out, and Hammer asked Ealing Studios to loan them a director. Leslie Norman was sent over, and while Norman wasn't a bad director, he didn't care about the film, hated working for Hammer, and couldn't wait to get out of there. In such an environment, X the Unknown was filmed. And fortunately, I don't think any of this behind-the-scenes strife seeped onto the screen. It's a pretty good movie in spite of its difficulties. Of course, who's to say how much better it might have been had its director been someone passionate and invested in the project? This isn't a monster movie per se, I'd call it more of a thing movie, and it makes you wait a long time to find out what exactly that thing is. We've got this apparently bottomless crevice that's opened up, and we hear lots of ominous radioactive crackling, and we're all wondering what on earth is down there and how long is it going to be before we see anything. This gradual build-up may test some viewers' patience, and I confess when I started to watch the movie the first time years ago, I didn't end up sticking with it. I don't know if it's because I was bored or it was too scientific for the likes of me, but I wasn't engaged and I ended up walking away from it. This time, I didn't have any trouble, and I liked it better. It's not a tremendously exciting horror movie. There are some slow spots, there are some scenes that are pretty dialogue-heavy, but it's strong on suspense with some great visuals and well-timed thrills. Its good scenes are really good. American actor Dean Jagger stars as Dr. Royston, an eccentric scientist called in to investigate. While Royston can be a bit of a headache for others to work with, as he prefers tinkering in his shop over supervising routine tests, he makes for a very calm, inquisitive protagonist. Within the last year or two, I've seen Dean Jagger play significant roles in a couple older films, 1944's When Strangers Marry, opposite Kim Hunter, and 1955's The Eternal Sea, starring Sterling Hayden. Though I'd seen him in several other films in the past, he really stood out to me in these two performances. X the Unknown was a rare leading role for him, and He's fine. I always respect it when someone can get through a lot of scientific dialogue without falling on their face. And as Dr. Royston speculates on what the thing is and where it came from, Jagger does a good job making this theory, mumbo-jumbo though it may be, seem plausible. I think the key is that his delivery isn't over-dramatic. He doesn't talk like a guy who knows he's in a horror movie, and his character isn't an enigma or a churlish genius. He doesn't really fall into any of those cliches. He's just a guy who has studied radioactivity extensively. Leo McKern enters as an investigator from the Atomic Energy Commission in London looking into the recent casualties. He plays a good-natured character, one of the only laymen featured in the cast. He pairs well with Dr. Royston and is one of the first people to give his theory the time of day. I did miss some of the quips and quirky side characters that livened up certain other classic British sci-fi films, but we do have some humor in the beginning, with the soldiers wanting to hurry up so they can go back to camp and eat. Most prominently featured are Haggis and Spider. Haggis is played by Ian McNaughton, who went on to direct Monty Python's Flying Circus, and Spider is played by Anthony Newley, who later found even more fame as a singer and songwriter. But what the film may lack in colorful personality, it makes up for in atmosphere and effects. The settings are great. The desolate-looking sand and gravel pits, referred to in film as the Ridges, the spooky tower, the stark, chilly woods at night. It was obviously very cold when they filmed this movie. Everyone's bundled up. Jagger's often wearing an overcoat and a sweater, plus a scarf and a watch cap. We can see actors' breath whenever they're outside, and you know it's not computer-generated. And there are certain scenes that stand out, like the one with the boys in the woods, the one where the assistant ventures down the fissure, the one where the toddler waddles toward danger. The suspenseful music is good, written by prolific Hammer horror composer James Bernard. His score does some heavy lifting here, conveying a palpable sense of terror even when there's technically nothing to see. For a good while, all we get are long shots of people looking terrified as they slowly back away. It's quintessential low-budget horror stuff, just reactions, only suggestions of the monster. But suddenly there's a scene that ups the ante by showing what the entity is capable of. They deliver some awesome effects here, and the build-up really pays off in this section of the film. The visuals are short but sweet, and by sweet, I mean very creepy. Now, let me drop a quick spoiler alert here. The way the film keeps this fact under wraps has led me to keep it under wraps. But it is something I have to talk about. I do want to say a couple things about the reveal and also the ending. So if you haven't seen the movie and you plan to, and you don't want to hear this, here's your warning. So a half hour in, I was wondering, when are we going to see this thing? And then another half hour after that, I was like, are we going to see this thing or what? And at last, we do. And the effects are pretty good. It's a cool thing, it's a good concept, a good idea. It's not as striking to look at as the makeup and prosthetics, but it's still visually interesting, and they did a good job with it. The thing is, as soon as you see it, you say, oh, it's the Blob. I know it's unfair. This movie came out 2 years before the Blob. But in terms of pop culture, that is the more familiar movie. And when the monster reveal turns out to be something that we've seen before, well, it's a little anticlimactic. I'll also throw in that this movie's in black and white and the Blob is in color, which in that instance is definitely an advantage. I love black and white, but the Blob being in color so that you can see that red, it really does kick it up a notch. This isn't the only black and white Blob movie either. 1959's Kaltiki the Immortal Monster has a similar kind of thing and similar effects, and I would argue that the Quatermass movies gave us something like this as well. So it's a case of subsequent films stealing this movie's thunder in the climactic moment, making this monster seem slightly less impressive than it should be. And it's kind of a drawn-out climax too. The thing struggles to maintain its novelty for as long as it takes the protagonist to figure out how to finish it off. I do appreciate that the problem is difficult to solve, though. I'd be complaining if they figured it out too quickly. At last we reach a conclusion, and it's a somewhat troubling one. They've defeated the thing, and then suddenly there's a big explosion. The men ask Dr. Royston, "What was that?" And he says, "I don't know, but it shouldn't have happened." But they shrug it off, saying, "Well, we got it anyway," and it ends with everyone else walking away while Royston goes for a closer look at the fissure, which prompts the question, is it really over? In a way, it's a good ending. There's no clear explanation of what the thing was or how it came about. Royston's theory is neither confirmed nor denied, and that unsolved mystery of its origin suggests this incident could occur again, in the near or distant future. While it left me scratching my head a bit, I do think it's a decent ending to an overall decent film. And those are my thoughts on X the Unknown. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts on this movie if you've seen it in the comments below, and I'll be back next week. Thanks for watching.